Okay. As we're getting set up, and I think we're just missing Leah at the moment, so hopefully they'll be able to join us. But we will be starting with a round of introductions. So to give everybody a heads up and time to prepare, if you haven't already, the first set of introduction in which I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves, knowing that we'll be able to add more about what you do, the work, and the space. But to start off, there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that I'm going to ask you to do. Number 1 will be your name. So choose how you want to share and identify in terms of that way. So your name. 2, pronouns. 3, the native lands that you're on from where you are reaching us today. 4, any identifiers that are important to you. This can be around ethnicity, gender, role, nationality. That's really up for you to decide and share. And then 5, in 1 sentence, describe the cool thing you do in this space. It's kind of an invitation to say, what do you do for work? But I don't want to make it sound like, what do you do for work? It's just, what's something cool about what you get to do? Okay? So that's going to be the invitation. And hello, Leah. Welcome. I think we have everybody started. So we'll go around in a circle to provide everybody the time to get started. If we get to you and like you just want to quickly pass, you can just say, we'll come back to me. Perfect. All right, so we'll start with you, Manuel, and then we'll go down Manuel, Melodie, Jackie, Ariana, and then Leah.
Was muted there, sorry. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Latino Outdoors, for having us here. Yeah, really grateful to be here. My name is Manuel Belmonte. I go by he, him, his. I'm on the native lands and territory of the Kumeyaay people who are currently fighting against having some of their lands bombed for this racist border wall. And there's efforts currently going on to stop that. I'm a first-generation Chicanx and current program coordinator for Latino Outdoors San Diego. I'm also a co-founder for the Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice. And our work revolves around transnational climate justice, and we're advocating for indigenous people in so-called Chile and Argentina, the Lincoln and Coyo, who are battling against mining, who's threatening to take their water, displace indigenous people, offer electric vehicles and efficient batteries for so-called climate change solutions. Yeah. Thanks.
Hey everyone, my name is Mel Mendez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am Irene from Harlem, New York City. So as some of you might know, most of New York City is Lenape, and that includes the Harlem area. I am currently not nearly as cool as Manuel or some of the other panelists you'll hear today. I am a publicist in the corporate space, but my history in public relations and marketing has focused on outdoor brands and outdoor services. So you can think of the REIs, Arc'teryx's of the world. That's kind of where I've played for a majority of my professional career, but my side hustle and my passion is with Latino Outdoors. I am an outdoor leader here in New York City, and you know, it's just been an amazing opportunity. Once you know, engage with folks like you know that everyone's going to hear from on this panel, but also you know really just trying to bridge the outdoor access and resources to the Latinx community here in the tri-state area. It has always been a huge passion of mine. I've considered myself, you know, a rolling stone, and you know, whether it's globally or here in New York, the divide is significant. And so to be a part of an organization where I'm actively working to bridge that gap has been exciting.
Great. Hey everyone, my name is Jackie Ostfeld. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm not really in Shenandoah National Park, which is the picture behind me. I'm in my attic in Washington, D.C., which is the land of the Nacoshank people, also known as Anacostans, who are largely believed to no longer be with us. Many of the Nacoshank people were wiped out by colonizers and European diseases, and those who weren't did join some of the neighboring Piscataway tribes around the Washington, D.C. region, and many others were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. And so it is a tribe that doesn't get a lot of recognition. It's still not federally recognized in our country, but that is a very small area inside Washington, D.C. near the Anacostia River. I am a third generation Ashkenazi Jew. My great-grandparents immigrated through Ellis Island, New York City, just about 100 years ago to escape persecution in Eastern Europe. And I'm not much of a religious person, but the struggles and resiliency of my people really helped play a major role in shaping my identity and who I am today. So also acknowledge that I'm white, cisgendered female. I derive a lot of my passion and strength from nature and my connection to the natural world. And that is what I get to do. I love my job. I work as the director of Sierra Club's Outdoors for All campaign. And I get to spend my day with the most amazing people, staff, volunteers, partners, to work towards a just, equitable, and inclusive environmental movement that really advances justice, equity and inclusion, and making sure that all people have a stable climate, clean air, clean water, and a direct connection to nature. So thank you so much, Jose, for inviting me to join this panel, and to all of you, I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ariana Cano. I go by Adi, or Ariana is also great. I use she and her pronouns. I am currently sitting in Wabanaki Confederacy land, specifically the Abenaki tribe, so New England, Northern New England region. I am kind of a hodgepodge of the outdoor worlds. Specifically, I'm currently pursuing a PhD in environmental social psychology with a really big emphasis on trying to understand people's environmental attitudes towards forest and environmental threats. But because of that, that's led me to kind of not just me move to a very Nordic part of the world and experience a completely different type of the outdoors that I was ever used to. I've started learning a lot about that interconnection between not just academia, but also the environmental conservation world, and in my own interest, pursuing the outdoors and how different that can look from different perspectives. I am originally from Caracas, Venezuela, and both of my parents are from Colombia. So I come from a very long line of migration, and a very relative migration. You know, I identify a lot with being an immigrant, especially being an immigrant in the place where I was born, and then moving to a country where we were always immigrants, and eventually my own migration to the north. And in addition to that, I also, aside from the academic part, I work for a snowboard company, doing similar research to what I would do in the academic setting, but more towards the sport itself and trying to understand why people choose the sport. So that's given me a very interesting perspective as well, more from that corporate America lens, and the sport aspect of recreating in the outdoors and how that can take place. Very excited to be here, so thank you so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Leah Thomas and my pronouns are she, her. I'm in Santa Barbara, California, moving to Ventura, which is Chumash land. And what do I do? So I was a National Park Service Ranger intern, and I also studied environmental science and policy. I'm very Black and very proud of being Black, African American, what's up? I also am the founder, accidental CEO of the Intersectional Environmentalist platform. And our goal is to really dismantle systems of oppression and the environmental movement and uplift the voices of BIPOC people in the LGBTQ+ community and disabled communities, and amplify the work that they're already doing, not reinvent the wheel, but just really create a safe space and platform for representation. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. I'm also an activist and a writer, and I love writing about intersectional environmentalism.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you all. And my name is Jose Guadalupe Adonis Gonzalez Rosales, with a little bit of the Leon. I am he, him, his, él. And I am calling everybody from Sacramento, California, which are ancestral, traditional, unceded, and stolen lands of the Maidu and Miwok, among a few other communities. I am excited to be here with all of you. So I'm an immigrant from Mexico, so I came over at a young age, very much a dreamer before dreamer was a term. And I'm also kind of a Chicano, quote unquote, conservationist in terms of my background is in education, although my academic work is also in natural resources, and a lot of my current work and passion is in the outdoor reconnection or outdoor reconnection component. And so by now, I think we'll probably have all of the audience present. So two quick logistic pieces. I am the moderator and I cannot see what goes into the chat. So audience members, if you have access to the chat, you can drop in questions and comments. Questions will be kind of collected that we'll get to towards the end of our conversation here. But we also have an invitation to start to please drop in the chat where are you connecting in from, and of course the invitation to use locations and native lands as appropriate as well. So with that, we are going to get started because you're here because the title is it's around intersectional environmentalism, right? So and Leah just mentioned that at the beginning and connected with that. I'm going to start by reading again part of that definition that Leah has put out into the world and turning it over to her to expand a little bit on that. And then we'll open it up. We'll go from that with all of our other guests and panelists. So now we're here with the theme of intersectional environment. Excuse me, my English is not very good looking this late in the day. So what is intersectional environmentalism? That's the theme that we're here for. So this is an inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. It identifies the ways in which injustices happening to marginalized communities and the earth are interconnected. It brings injustice done to the most vulnerable communities and the earth to the forefront and does not minimize or silence social inequality. Intersectional environmentalism advocates for justice for people and planet. That's by Leah Thomas. So we want to start, Leah, like what, can you expand a little bit about where the ideation that came from that, kind of you put this into the world a short while ago, and yet we're a large reason of why we're having this conversation is because of the call. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Of course, thank you so much for reading that. I think for me, I learned about intersectional theory when I was in college around 2014, 2015, and intersectional theory was created by another incredible Black woman named Kimberly Crenshaw, and it really looks at the holistic nature of someone's identity from race to culture to gender to religion, so on, and how all those overlapping identities can impact the way that someone experiences both prejudices and privileges. It's not, so for me as an African-American woman who's also cis and straight, like those things, all those aspects of my culture play into the way that I experience the world around me. So when I was thinking about the other resurgence, I guess, in 2020 of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I was feeling a lot of silence from the environmental community at the time, I wanted to really find a way to make sure environmentalists knew that the Black Lives Matter fight and the fight for people, especially BIPOC people, is also an environmental issue. So I'm sure people have put these two words together before. I don't want to claim that I created it, but it seems like maybe. So I just really wanted to create something that made sense because I could no longer participate in the quote unquote progressive environmentalism that we had prior to this definition existing, because it was honestly causing so much harm in the world to my community in particular when I was examining the data of who was impacted by environmental injustices the most. So I just said, you know what, until this modern environmentalism catches up, I just want to create my own, and I want other people to join me if they like. And it seems like the world heard me in a really major way, and a lot of people were looking for something like this. So intersectional theory, I didn't create that. Kimberly Crenshaw is amazing, and because of that, I was able to put these two words together as an environmentalist to make it just embedded in environmentalism. So until one day I really hope we don't need to preface environmentalism with intersectionality. One day, hopefully, when people think of environmentalists, they'll automatically realize they'll think about someone who advocates for both social justice and environmentalism. But until that day, we have intersectional environmentalism. And yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that. And so we're going to open that up to our other guests. You know, that idea, like you said, you can have an idea, a theme, a term, and a practice that can describe and capture often what we do, who we are, how we represent. And so in the many ways that a lot of Latinx communities are conservationists in practice, right? But they don't use that term, or maybe are not seen as such, doesn't preclude the fact that you can't be it and have those practices. So along the same lines, to our other guests, Manuel, Ariana, Jackie, Melodie, how does intersectional environmentalism show up in your space, in your work, or how does that relate to what you do? And Ariana, we'll start with you.
Thank you. So at least for my experiences, a lot of it has been very evident throughout research, you know, and it's more like the lack of intersectional lens that comes to when we start thinking about how do we approach environmental problems as an academic or research concept. And one quick example I give, so my particular research focuses on invasive insects in the New England forest, right? So if we all agree that we have land and we're trying to protect it from a forest management perspective, there's these pests and we want to make sure that they don't harm the said forest, right? So pretty A to B concept. And a lot of what I have noticed throughout my experience in this field, especially as a social psychologist and a social scientist, in order to collect this data, we tend to use landowner data. And it in part is because it's like readily available, it's easy to access. Oftentimes academic grants don't give you endless amount of money to, you know, find this data. But one of the biggest things that I've started pushing for more is that land ownership is extremely limiting, right? And we have this long history of publications and papers when it comes to forest management by just surveying landowners. I mean, we know the history in the US that, of course, women and people of color were not allowed to own land until very much so later, and that it propels a cycle. So something like that, as simple as that, are very interesting examples of just thinking of the data itself, of who we're asking the questions and how and what the lens looks like and how it's shaped. That it's a way that, you know, that piece of intersectional environmentalism is not necessarily showing up, right? But in other ways, in a sense of how things might look a little bit different, is that we are potentially getting to the place where we're asking these questions, right? And at first I came into this field thinking like, oh, we have the natural and the physical sciences, and then we have the social sciences, and there are these two silos. And at first that felt like the battle that we had to fight, right? Like, how do these two identities in academic fields talk to each other? And there's more crossover, but now we're starting to see that it's not just kind of from the natural to the social sciences, but also all around, all across, from different lenses, from different communities, different languages, and the ways that we uphold as academic and scientific are starting to look more inclusive, because it's essentially needed for a field in natural resources and natural conservation to look at it from all angles and not just say this is the only way we can accomplish the results that we want.
Right. Thank you. Jackie?
Thank you. And I'll start by saying that, Leah, I greatly appreciate the definition that you've offered in putting this out into the world. I find the term intersectional environmentalism just to be really helpful in deepening the dialogue that we're having in this space and in my work. In my role at Sierra Club, and also in a lot of the partnership work that I do with partners through the Outdoors Alliance for Kids, we work to name and break down the barriers, both physical and social, that really prevent all people from being able to get the benefits that we all know that we can have from a connection with nature. If you missed it, earlier this week, the Hispanic Access Foundation and Center for American Progress released a new report called the Nature Gap, I think, but it demonstrates that 74% of communities of color in the contiguous United States, so I don't think it's including Puerto Rico, live in what they're calling nature deprived areas. And We know that Black, Indigenous, people of color are most likely to live in communities with polluted air, polluted water, to bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change, to die from environmental pollution. COVID-19's impact on Black and Indigenous communities is a stark example of the impact of the environmental and social injustices that really plague our country and our planet. And so, and we also know that time outdoors and access to clean air and places to run and play and improve your physical and mental health are not shared equitably. So when I think about, you know, beyond the inequities in the physical access, not just having the spaces, but we also have become, you know, it's also become much more apparent since the pandemic started that folks don't have that physical access. But we also know that from hearing your stories and stories from so many in the BIPOC community, that people with marginalized identities are more likely to face physical violence and harassment when they step outside their homes. And that threat of violence and harassment extends to our public lands, which are stolen lands from the get-go. So to me, intersectional environmentalism really means that we center the voices, the perspectives, the insights of the individuals, the communities who are most marginalized when it comes to being able to access their rights to a stable climate, to clean air, to clean water, to enjoy the benefits of nature. And I, you know, at the risk of leaving someone out, because you always do, there's just so many wonderful people that are working in this space, but our outdoors community already has, Leah, you named this, it already has so many leaders like Jose and all of you on this call, and Room Map and Audrey Peterman and Carolyn Finney and Teresa Baker and so many organizations like Melanin Base Camp and Brown People Camping that have been sounding alarm bells for years on equity, inclusion in the outdoors. And so to me, intersectional environmentalism means we listen to the demands, we learn, we humbly work in solidarity to advance the solutions that are already out there, and that will ultimately better serve people and the planet.
Thank you, Jackie. Melodie?
I was just taking notes because Jackie and Ariana, you both, for me, when I approach environmental intersectionalism in any capacity, you know, for me, what is most personal and most overt is taking it through an urban environment perspective, right? So being in New York City, I think you both talk about, you know, this access to home ownership and how that has had, you know, historically been such a huge driving force in the data and the research and the perspective in which we talk about the environment, right? And I think, you know, one of the hot words that, you know, I've been learning more and more about is redlining, right? And I think, you know, even in the political landscape, you know, we're hearing a lot more politicians talk about what is redlining and the impacts that it has had on the BIPOC community. And I think, you know, oftentimes what I think we miss when we have those conversations is I think we talk about it from like the early 1900s, right? I think, you know, that one in itself is a huge miss because we're talking about, you know, we need to talk about 400 years of oppression in the United States. But I think so often people think, you know, redlining started in the 1930s when, you know, discriminatory home lending practices were more prevalent. And then, you know, then we talk about it ended in the 1960s, which I think we can all agree on this panel, that's just not true, right? I think we can all say that, yes, we became more aware of redlining and the practices of, you know, discriminatory investment in communities, but the impacts are far ranging. And I think, you know, for me in New York City, one or many of the biggest challenges we face when we're talking about you know, communities and their access to resources and natural spaces is, for example, you know, it's as prevalent as access, simple transportation. I think, you know, there are still areas in New York City that we, you know, put on a pedestal oftentimes for this like metropolis utopia or something. And, you know, there are places in Brooklyn, in the heart of Brooklyn, that have lack of access to green spaces. Even I live in Harlem, and, you know, I can hop on the Metro North and go upstate to get on some incredible trails. But what if I couldn't afford the entry fee into the Metro North? And, you know, I think, you know, what we focus on in Latino Outdoors in the NYC chapter, particularly, is bridging that access. And, you know, it's incredible. One of our partners from the Nature Conservancy, the New York City chapter, recently participated in a survey with all of their partners and subsidiary kind of communities and collaborators. And the number one issue that was impacting communities towards natural spaces was this transportation and the lack of it in these places. So I think, you know, for me, that urban aspect is such a huge part of how I approach this work. And that, you know, stems into many other things that, you know, I don't want to commandeer this topic, but, you know, when we talk about food deserts as well in this city and, you know, how that leads to lack of health and nutrition and food sovereignty. And then, you know, and what's exciting though, not to make this all negative and kind of, you know, tough to hear, but there is a resurgence, like what Leah was saying, that has stemmed definitely from the Black Lives Matter movement. And then also from, you know, there's Harlem Grown, there's community food refrigerators that are popping up. And all of these local grassroots efforts are so important in helping us bridge those gaps and talk about how we bring justice to these marginalized communities so heavily impacted. So mouthful, I'll pass it over to Manuel.
Orale. Close out this question, Manuel.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think you all summed up the term very well. Intersectional environmentalism, I actually didn't read that term until I read your article, Leah. So yeah, thank you for that. To me, it seems like another way to kind of say environmental justice, which incorporates a lot of the things that you all have already been saying, how race, gender, and, you know, your own cultural identities even, and more than that, affect the way you experience and live the world. I think, thinking back to Justice first started, we started teaching a class at the University of California, San Diego, and it was a cohort of ethnic studies majors and environmental scientists that got together to teach this course. And at the beginning, there was a lot of folks that were taking the class. It was the science and critical analysis of environmental justice. And so people started taking this course and we're like, hey, I'm here because I thought we were learning about justice for the environment. What is all this race stuff you're talking about? What is, you know, what is all this like social structures that you're talking about? I'm here to learn about how to protect the outdoor pristine wilderness, you know? And so to me, what flipping the term environmental justice into intersectional environmentalism does is it provides kind of a stepping stone for environmentalists to really like grasp and understand that things don't happen in a vacuum. These food deserts that you're talking about, let me see, like the pollution that disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, people of color. All these things are things that are happening to people's environment, and based on your positionality in life, that term can mean many different things, you know, the environment. And so I think intersectional environmentalism is really a great way to interconnect how racism, heteropatriarchy, social cultural disparities, and white supremacy all are what's really behind the degradation of our environment and behind things like climate change. I think it's environmental justice / intersectional environmentalism where folks should be really focusing their efforts to get at the foundations, these structures that I named that are the root causes for climate change, and not really look at it like a CO2 count that's really affecting the world. Because even if we succeed, and I'm not saying that I'm a proponent for like things like electric vehicles, but even if that happens, these systems of oppression are still not going to be dismantled, and it's just going to take on a different form, and one that's green and allegedly clean for everyone to be, you know, living and thriving from. So that's what I think in intersectional environmentalism is a stepping stone, you know, to get people to wake up.
Gracias, Manuel. That's an interesting thing about what does the green revolution look like without liberation, right? And so you all provided such a wealth of pieces. I think that for somebody that's in this space, they could be able to see all the facets that you put in here, from just the power that's invested in the ownership of land and how that manifested early to later in redlining, the components that you're mentioning around park poor communities, food poor communities, all these different components, and how there's this connection behind them. And so also, Ariana, as you were talking about the social and quote unquote social and natural sciences, and back when we used the term interdisciplinary, right? And we have the terms interconnection. And then we have, of course, this idea of intersectionality. I'm going to frame this to throw this back at you, Leah, to get your thought on this, because you had mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw, right, as kind of the main author of this concept of intersectionality, especially back in the 70s, to look at essentially how Black women were being left out, not of the feminist movement, but really kind of the legal infrastructure. And to think of intersectionality as a literal intersection of two roads, and how is the system set up to provide relief, like the courts, for example. If you're Black, maybe this is the course, and if you're a woman, this is the course. But if you happen to be a Black woman right in the middle, the ambulance is not going to come for you because it's not a specifically prescribed road. Right? So that visual that she provided has stuck with me as really thinking about not just the connection of things, but really as to who are we leaving in the gaps, and who do we need to be attentive that needs to be centered and supported in that way, that you can face disparity as a woman, face disparity by being Black, but how does that compound when you're a Black woman? And so, Leah, why do you think that there's a resurgence behind, even though this is a term from the 70s, for example, why do you think that there's a resurgence right now? You said you didn't, you're like, I'm sure it was already out there, but you put it out into the world and boom.
I think, yeah, you made so many incredible points, because in college, it was actually really interesting because I was, the Women's March, the first one, was happening when I was in college as well. And I didn't see myself reflected in a lot of mainstream feminist circles. I tried to join a feminist club in Orange County where there were no BIPOC. And I just, every time I would try to say, like, okay, we've got this statistic about women, white women, owning a certain amount to every male's dollar. And I would want to come back and say, well, what about Latinx women? What about Black women? What about Indigenous women, when the numbers go down and down and down to every white man's dollar? And it seems like the responses I would get were kind of all lives matter type responses in those feminist circles of like, all women matter, let's not complicate it and fight together. But what that really means about not complicating it is to shut up as a BIPOC and fight for the advancement of white women, and then my freedom and liberation maybe can be secondary. So some white woke friends actually at the time were like, hey, there's this thing called intersectional theory, intersectional feminism, and they were incredible allies and kind of pulled me into that. So I've been thinking about it for a while, because I didn't understand why I didn't want to go to the Women's March, because so many of my other peers felt so liberated in those spaces, but I just felt so unheard. And that's when I really started thinking about those multiple parts of my identity, and how, no, I don't have to advocate for the advancement of just white people or just white women. When I was thinking about environmentalism, when I was in my environmental policy classes and I was learning about the Clean Air Act, meanwhile, my family's back home in Ferguson and my sister's getting tear gassed. And I'm like, who is the clean air for? Who is the clean water for? If it's just for white people and my sister has to choke on, tear gas, then clearly this isn't working. And I got into the data a little bit more and learned about environmental justice. So I just really decided that I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not going to put my emotional labor behind the advancement of just white people. And this isn't fair anymore. And I know that's not really answering your question, but that's really what brought me to realizing what intersectional theory was, and that it should be applied to environmentalism. And I think environmentalists, we're at a crossroads right now, because the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 was even bigger than the movement in 2014, which impacted my hometown and community of Ferguson with the death of Michael Brown. And the resurgence, I think, was so much larger because we were at home in the comfort of our own homes, and we didn't have any distractions, and people had to pay attention to all the social injustices that were happening. So when I saw my environmentalist friends from the environmental organizations that I work for not even mentioning it and going about their lives as these protests were just erupting all over the media for various different BIPOC groups, I had a moment where I was so disappointed in my community, and that's what drew me to create this definition. And then I wasn't expecting environmentalists to embrace it as a whole, because why would they? They hadn't really been embracing environmental justice, which has been a term that's been there for a long time. But by putting it out there and seeing people circulate it in the way that they did, I realized that maybe some white environmentalists, they did want to be allies, but they didn't know that those intersections were there maybe, and they were looking for a term to invite them in to say, okay, this makes sense. And I wanted to play with that environmental language and continue to say, humans are animals, we are species, we are endangered. So I was using that type of terminology so environmentalists could say like, oh, this makes sense. So when I put that out there, again, it's not just me, it's all of you. There's so many people who have been saying the exact same thing. But as a communications person, as a writer, I wanted to play with the words to make sure environmentalists could see, okay, this is our fight too. And maybe that's why people are kind of grasping onto this a little bit more in the environmental community this go round.
Great, thank you for that. And so I'll throw another question at you, but we're going to break it up a little bit by challenging to respond with one word. This is going to be an association. So I'm going to ask each of you one word, and I'm going to ask you just to see what is a one-word response. Right? So it's kind of like a call and response. That's the challenge. And then we're going to go back to a longer response. And so I'll start with you, Ariana. Ready? Equity.
Challenging.
Jackie, you're next. Diversity.
White privilege.
Manuel, you're next. Inclusion.
Rainbows.
Leah, you're up. Equality.
Equity.
And then Melodie, you got this last one. Access.
Everyone.
Everyone. Thank you. So I threw that in there as an introduction to our next one. In terms of these are terms, right, that we use for some common understanding. And one of the big ones is justice, right? This idea of justice. You know, Jackie, like, justice is so embedded in what a lot of what the Sierra Club, especially at the national level, really is trying to strive for. And sometimes we'll have acronyms like diversity, equity, inclusion, DI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. Like, so there's a variation of them. But I want to focus on the justice component because it has a direct relationship with intersectional environmentalism, kind of like Manuel mentioned around environmental justice. And so I'm curious, what is justice to you in this context? You can explain it however it resonates with you, what a definition that you use, what it sounds like, what it feels like. Feel free to quote a favorite writer. I'm just curious, like when you hear the word justice and then in this phrase, you're no longer limited to one word, what does that mean to you? And let's start with Melodie.
For me, justice is, I think, pulling at the latter part of Leah's definition, it's about recognizing that we currently have a whole slew of marginalized people and communities that are not getting the same type of, I'm going to say access as a catch-all, but the same type of resources, knowledge, investments, XYZ, in this case, from an environmental lens. And I think justice for me is about addressing those problems head on in order to establish a sense of equality. And man, this is going to be such a battle of semantics, I think, and it's exciting too, right? Because, as we go through this environmental revolution, we're also revolutionizing our language and the way we talk about people and everything, right? And we evolve with that. So I think, for me, when we're talking about justice, and I think, in BIPOC communities, I think, some of that is like investing in, I think through it like as solutions, right? So like, I know if I invest in my local grassroots organizations, I'm directly trying to bridge the gaps that people are facing here in my community. I know if I vote, I'm doing it on a national level. And when I look at what my candidates stand for and are putting their dollars towards, that is how I apply it from a national lens. And then, historically as well, I think we need to talk about reparations. And I think, for Black communities, I think we need to talk about it for Native communities. And I think sometimes people see that as like this big, crazy, hairy word, and it's not, right? Reparations comes in a multitude of forms. And so we need to have that more prominent in our vocabulary and our language to be able to talk and digest what those look like, and what those solutions truly trickle down and look like.
Great, thank you. Manuel, you're up.
Oof, what does justice mean? That's a deep philosophical word or question, though. I mean, it's, to put it in layman's terms, I guess, it's just us, it's what we put into it, because in the end of the day, we're people pushing legislative bodies to either hear our concerns, and the louder we can make those concerns, the more likely they are to be heard. So I think it's very important for BIPOC communities to really be involved, and more importantly, so for white communities to really listen to the concerns of BIPOC folks, because over and over, we tend to be the more marginalized folks. And if you put the more marginalized folks and at the forefront, there's less of a chance to miss some of those people and have them slip through the cracks, like you were saying earlier, Jose. So yeah, I guess in like a simple term, it's just us, and it's whoever's willing to make the biggest sound. So I think with the resurgence that's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID-19, for folks to see the inequities that exist out in the world, and like Leah said, since you have a lot of free time in a sense, now is a really good time to really make some noise. Melodie, I'm definitely all for reparations and rematriation of land. I mean, I think something that the Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice is really focused on is decolonizing for climate. We have this understanding that in order for the environment and the climate to be really saved, we have to decolonize. We have to go back and dismantle all of these systems of oppression that came in about 400 to 500 years ago. A very intelligent, powerful woman I know said recently that climate change started 500 years ago. This isn't something new. And I think if we center these voices and if we really put them at the forefront, we'll have a justice that benefits all and not just the privileged few.
Thank you, Manuel. Jackie, you're up.
I appreciate all those definitions. I mean, I guess at its core, justice is righting a wrong. I think it means acknowledging and owning that the status quo, which is white supremacy, it is neoliberal capitalism, that it's not serving people equitably. Justice demands, I think, that Black, Indigenous, people of color have the right to self-determination, that those of us who are white, who work in primarily white organizations and spaces, have responsibility to stand in solidarity with demands for justice, like those that are coming from the Movement for Black Lives and other racial and social justice groups. It means we tear down monuments to racism and oppression, both literally and figuratively. And systems too, not just the symbols, over policing, the systems that are causing harm. And to, as Melodie say, I completely agree, working towards reparations, restorative justice, reparations. And as a white woman in this space, it means that I got to do the work, that it's hard. And for me and folks that look like me and walk through life like me. We need to commit to fight back against white supremacy and bigotry, including and especially within ourselves. Just knowing that we're all born into the system of white supremacy. That's not our fault, but choosing to do nothing about it is totally our fault and in our sphere of influence. And so I think just, you know, for me, admitting and understanding that basic truth that I personally, for whatever challenges in life I've had, you know, I personally have benefited and continue to benefit from the system of white supremacy. And that's just a critical first step on my own journey. And I got to do that so that I can show up for y'all in the ways that y'all need me to be there.
Thank you, Jackie. No, Leah and then Ariana.
What does justice mean? I think for me, something that has been really interesting this last like month and a half, because I had like a relatively private, small life, and then all of a sudden like virality, and it's scary. But I'm so grateful. But I think before this, I was very quiet. I'm still kind of quiet and awkward, but I didn't feel confident in what I was saying. And then to have that sort of validation, I don't know, or just people seeing and hearing me for the first time, it just was so energizing. And it made me realize, like, I think something that a lot of people need right now is just to feel seen and heard and validated. And there might not be a metric that can, you know, rate or score if people are feeling seen, heard, and validated. But I think justice to me is helping other people, especially voices that have been marginalized, just be amplified by giving people a seat at the table. And we shouldn't have to fight for a seat at the table, especially I'm coming from a communications perspective when I was working on the communications team of an environmental place. And a mistake that they made that they have since rectified is they didn't consult the Black people when writing a statement about our livelihoods for Black Lives Matter. And I think moving forward, like, giving BIPOC, giving people in the LGBTQ plus community and disabled communities a seat at the table and serious decision-making processes. And I think we could undo a lot of unjust systems and really tackle and dismantle systems of oppression if our voices and our efforts are just magnified. Because again, the people are there. We're right here on this panel, and hopefully with Intersectional Environmentalists, the website we made, we can make the case, like, here are the people, support their work and initiatives. And I think, to me, that's one step in accomplishing true justice.
I mean, I so appreciate all the different, but yet very similar perspectives to this one word, and how, you know, what Melodie, echoing what Melodie said at the beginning, we can get into semantics. And I guess for me, you know, I want to talk more from the perspective of the white passing privilege that I hold, and echo a lot of what Jackie was saying. Justice should be very uncomfortable, right? And I think it's because that word in itself is nested in a system of power and oppression. And if we're asking for justice, there's a power dynamic. Or if someone else is asking for justice, there's a power dynamic. So for someone that holds a lot of privilege like me, justice, at least, it echoes self-awareness, right? And the idea to be very much so in tune with, where am I in this space, and who are these people asking for justice, and what that looks like, which is really counterintuitive, because you would think that if you want justice, we should be all hands on deck, do all these things, and, you know, everyone figure it out. But really, I think the first step is almost like, okay, recognize where you are at the table. And if you are one of those that is kind of like in the front seat, and you hold this privilege in regards to others talking about justice, it's not necessarily your time to like talk about and figure out what to do, but it's more of like asking those questions and trying to tip the scales, because it is really difficult. I think that that's like the challenging part, right? That like, this is years in the making of oppression, years in the making of silencing people, of really getting to the root of what they need to survive. And it's really difficult to even start thinking about what does one ask for in regards to justice. So it's a very long, messy process.
Yeah, thank you. And I asked that because we'll have another 2, maybe 3 at most questions before we move into the audience questions. For myself, you know, I'm trained as an academic, right, to engage in some of these terms. and yet they have to have real practical meaning and impact. And that's not exclusive of each other. They can hold all these facets. So my challenge has always been for myself is when I use a term, what does that look like for myself in terms of an orientation, a reflection, right? A direction, a reflection, and kind of a practice. And so I think about the simplification really through the amplification of an idea. And so I think of justice as this component of restoring a whole, right? If an injustice is a taking, what does justice look like as a restoring? And as a reflection is, what does justice look like when I face the question, as Jackie said, referred to, what power am I willing to give up? And conversely, what power am I holding on to such that I harm somebody else? And then as a practice, of course, is that healing a harm, right? Like, what does that look like in terms of that transition? Because I'm reminded of the Dr. Cornel West quote, right? That justice is what love looks like in public, as an example. And that connects me to Martin Luther King Jr. as well as his ideas around love, power, and justice, right? Like these, how we can hold these together. So I say that because for this next one, we're here for Latinx Conservation Week. That's kind of the component that's hosting us here. And so intersectionality is also an invitation to look at our multifaceted identities, right? Like how we hold all of these spaces. So I wanted to ask you to share a little bit about that idea of identity more. I myself went from an identity thinking of like being bicultural to ambicultural to now what I think of as a quantum cultural type of identity. So for you science nerds, we can talk more about that later. But how do you connect the concept and frame of intersectionality to your own cultural identity? You know, Leah came into this space and said, strongly, affirmingly, I'm Black, right? And so what does that look like? And the way that I'm going to phrase this question is we'll start with somebody, and then that person will get to invite the next person to share. Right? So it'll be off of my hands. And this time we will start with Leah, unless she wishes to pass.
I did take up a lot of space, so I'm going to pass to Manuel.
Thank you, Leah. Intersectionality and my positionality. Well, I'm first generation Chicanx, right? So I continuously come across this dilemma of ni de aquí ni de allá. And I'm sure it's very common with other, first generation, second generation folks, where here in the States, I'm clearly brown, right? And like my privileges, my lived experiences, and also this box that I'm put into at the same time, like, are based on this concept of me being brown, and it depends on who's looking at me. But when I go and visit family in Mexico, soy del otro lado, I'm from the other side, and Ariana, I'm from the north. Game of Thrones reference, but so yeah, like, I don't know, I've been called gringo out there too, which here is like, how, So yeah, there's this dynamic, or this dilemma that really forces me to explain who I am and my position. I think I didn't start embracing the term Chicano or Chicanx until more recently. I think once I got into college, because growing up, my parents were always like, "Tú eres Mexico-Americano," like your blood is Mexican, but you live in the United States, kind of thing. And I was like, okay, so that's kind of what I embraced for the longest. But growing up, and especially talking to family back home, I had to like start to explain that, I'm not gringo. I'm not like fully Americano, like, like this white ideal or archetype that is prevalent. And so I think the term Chicano was really a term that I came to embrace through the help of like some really like activists and socially conscious folks that I met at the university. So yeah, it's me having to explain how it is that I navigate a space here and to there and over there, explaining to them how I navigate a space here. So it's ni de aquí ni de allá, you know. It's hard to put into words for me, but yeah, the intersectionality comes into place because I've got things that overlap, things that don't tend to overlap. I guess to like someone that's not me, but to me, that like I am the intersection of all these positions that I am, you know, that make me. So yeah.
And you have the ability to pass it on.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna pass it on to Melodie.
Thanks, Manuel. I think you said you didn't know how to put it into words, and I was over here like, this is a Sunday word for me. Like, I felt everything that you said, and I do not identify as Mexican. I'm biracial. I'm Puerto Rican and Filipina, and I think, you know, that intersection, that biracial and like bi-communal, bi-coastal identifiers are tough, I think, you know, as you were saying, and how you see yourself and navigate yourself in this world, when everyone is trying to put a label and really make sure, like, okay, how do I categorize someone and talk through it? I think, you know, for me, what I love the most about this question is, I think, you know, professionally, I was never super involved. Professionally, my work is not in like activism and advocacy. And so for me, what I love about this question is like, what is your lived truth, right? And how does that impact in the work that we are all doing in some form of another, right? And, you know, my history, I was this broke biracial girl in the Bronx. Like, I checked all these boxes and all the stereotypes. And, you know, one day I was selected to be part of this program that helped me get out of my community. And I think, you know, going back to when we talk about that narrative, right, and the language that we use, I think, you know, up until I want to say like 2 years ago, I always saw myself as someone who got out of my community. And I think that's a huge problem, right? When we uplift BIPOC communities and say that where you are from is not where you need to be, that's a huge problem. Because I think it further filters into, you know, systems of oppression and white supremacy. It devalues our communities and whether or not we invest back into them. So I think, you know, for a long time, I really struggled with that. And then I went to a great high school, and then I went to a private liberal arts college. And believe me, in 2018, I was on top of the world. And you know, I felt like I couldn't relate anymore. And I think this whole movement has really allowed me to kind of reflect back on who I am and where I come from and the language that I use when talking about when talking about environmental justice. And I think for such a long time, I used my education and so many of my many other facets of my life that hold privilege to be a gatekeeper for people. And that was such a huge problem. And, you know, when you say, for someone who might not know what gatekeeping is, it's just this idea of saying that there's this level of to access, you know, certain knowledge or information or to welcome someone into a community or a group. And I felt for such a long time that in order to be a true advocate or activist or whatever, there were XYZ components you had to match. And, you know, challenging myself and coming back down to my identity and the root of why I wanted to do the things that I did and help my community and be a part of my community and be a part of those, again, grassroots efforts. It's all cyclical, you know, really took a lot of unpacking and a lot of like challenging myself and saying, okay, like, where do I fit in this role and what's stopping me from being a better advocate for my community? So I think that was definitely tangential to your question, Jose, but that was my truth. So I will kick it over to Ariana.
Thank you. First, I would like to say that, oh, wow, like just hearing this is one of the reasons why I love the inter and the emphasis on the intersectionality, you know, like add anything there, because I have been so within the world of environmentalism and conservation. Yet I don't often get to hear about other Latinx and other individuals with varying identities explain where they're coming from. So this just like makes me really happy, and a lot of what both of you said just resonates so much. I really like the ni de aquí ni de allá part, just because I often, you know, I've had this theme throughout my whole life where I feel like I have to create this like simple identity for others, where like my life has been not simple in regards to my identity, right? So my parents migrated from Colombia to Venezuela due to economic pressures from the country just being in terrible shape, leading up to Venezuela, and then eventually us migrating out of Venezuela to the United States, landing in South Florida, which is a very, very diverse South and Central American populations. And then part of me just saying, you know what, I'm gonna try something new. And eventually I started my own migration to the north of the United States. And I've always been on this chase to figure out, what is my identity? What am I? Am I Colombian? Am I Venezuelan? Am I Spanish? Because then you look at like, you know, all my white friends saying I'm 30% Dutch, and I'm like, I don't know, no one told me what we are. And the thing that has stuck the most, and part of the biggest theme of this varying identity and what I've taken the most, is that for a long time, especially living in Vermont, which is so polarly different than where I grew up. And it's also painful for my parents to understand why I would ditch the tropics to go live in like negative 30 degree in like May or something, you know, something out of this world. And they're like, why? Like, what do you do this? And, you know, I started getting like really into like being outdoors and enjoying the outdoors in the winter. And they're like, what is wrong with you? You can have such a nice like beach life. And part of it was, you know, that this theme and this need as a migrant of resiliency that like, to me, it just didn't make sense. I was like, no, it's nice. It's like snow. Yeah, sure. It's cold. But like, I don't really see it. I mean, it's not, you know, and that in itself has a lot of privilege, because my parents were like, hey, we landed here. This place is nice. How about you just enjoy it? And I'm like, no, I want to like go out to the north and like suffer in the winter. So then a lot of this identity started shifting from not just like trying to check the boxes, but try to pull out what were the elements of certain identities that I appreciated so much and I learned so much. And at least like that piece around migration was so crucial for me, because it was like, yeah, maybe I don't know if I'm 30% Dutch or German or whatever, but I know that I'm 100% part of a group of people that continuously move, and whether it's for survival or for pleasure or for, you know, romance or whatever. And there were such interesting themes that have now translated into how I recreate outside, how I pursue the career path that I've pursued. And that's been really useful and really interesting, but also a very long process to try to identify, of course. And I will now pass it to Jackie.
Thank you, Ariana. I love hearing these stories. I shared a little bit of this in my intro, I guess, but I'm third generation Ashkenazi Jew. My great grandparents came to New York City by way of Ellis Island in the early 1900s to escape religious persecution in Eastern Europe, Russia, Romania, Poland. They worked in the garment industry, and while Jews are pretty well known for being a tight-knit group, it only took a couple generations for a lot of our customs and language and stories to be just completely lost in the name of acculturation. For example, except for just like a few curse words, I don't speak any Yiddish, and neither do my parents, but my grandparents certainly did. And while I'm not a religious person, I'm agnostic, but my entire childhood was spent learning about the Holocaust, reading the Diary of Anne Frank, eating Chinese food on Sundays, and the stories of the struggles and resilience of the Jewish people, I think, definitely played a major role in shaping my identity. And I also think it's important to note that there were just many times growing up where I had to hide my Jewish identity to protect myself. I think about a time when I took my first job as an environmental educator in South Carolina, and I was told by another Jew to never, ever tell anyone down there that I was Jewish. And So I learned to not talk about my identity. So Jose, I never quite know how to answer these questions. And I'm still learning how to talk about my social identity because it's been something that I've had the privilege to hide. And so I'll also just say that, as a white cisgendered female, which is my external identity that people can see, I am really mindful of, for the most part, that I benefit from being white and having that choice to hide my identity. And that I can just, I can pursue my dreams and largely walk through life pretty unharmed. I've certainly never been harassed or anything for visiting a national park in the United States. And, while I can't ever walk in someone else's shoes, I do think my upbringing gives me a little bit of a lens to be able to see injustice, because it's all rooted in white supremacy. And I'm working on my own social identity story and unpacking my own identity still. I probably will be for a lifetime. And also just working on how that, how my own self-transformation can help me to show up in those intersections and be better in solidarity and mutuality with anybody who experiences racism or misogyny or bigotry or other injustices that we have. So I don't know if I get to pass it to you, Jose?
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
Jackie. And I also want to honor Leah. That was a great modeling of the practice of making and taking space. So for anyone in the audience for whom that's new, that's the ability to actually be able to do that, to say I pass, or I'm sharing the space in that way. So I just want to honor that as a practice. And because we are limited by time, we're going to do one more question before we jump over to audience. And so I'll ask you to be as pithy as you feel you're able to be. Pithy meaning that kind of condense. Don't worry, there's no va a haber I forgot the sábado gigante being that came and said you're out of time con la trompeta. El chacal, that's what it was. Those of you know. And so for this one is 2050, right? By 2042, 2045, the US is going to be a quote unquote minority majority country. Really what that means is that it's finally going to reflect the people of the global majority, right? Those demographics look very different than the 1950s, right? Than 50, 100 years ago. So this intersectional future, that's 2050 and beyond, 2100, the work that you're doing now as a future ancestor, imagine the future. Give us a very quick description of what that looks like for you. And we'll start with you, Ariana.
Thank you. I think I'll be quick. One of the things that I've been really trying to focus a lot in regards to environmentalism and inclusivity is reframing how individuals engage in the environment, not by necessarily encouraging or pushing people to act outdoors in a specific way, but instead of creating a definition that's more encompassing. So a very quick example is in a lot of outdoor pursuits, there's this pressure to be the fastest, the strongest, the one that bags the most peaks. And I oftentimes look at my mom, who is plenty happy in the yard, and that's a form of environmentalism. That's a form of connecting with nature in her own way. So for me specifically, one of the things that I've been working on is how can I encourage others to also start looking at environmentalism and not as adrenaline junkie, aggressive ways. And hopefully we get to a place where we have a more encompassing definition of being recreational outside.
Thank you. Leah?
I would really hope that the positions of power also start to reflect the changing demographics, because something that I'm super excited about is the United States being truly reflective, like you said, of the people of the global majority. I'm pumped, but if positions of power don't reflect that as well, I'm scared that things won't change. So we'll see. I don't know. We've got incredible people like AOC leading the way, so maybe we'll get some more AOC types. I'd love that.
Awesome. Melodie?
I think for me, it's so hard sometimes because I'm so focused on the future, or so focused on the present. Like, who can I vote for now? Who can I support now in my community? And what can I do now to start chipping away at what I think so many people think is too hard, or, you know, what people think is like this impossible dream or ideal that we're all trying to drag ourselves towards. So I think, you know, for me, the future doesn't look as hard as we think, and it's easy.
Thank you. Jackie?
I just want to lift up what you all said. I mean, Leah, maybe you can be in Congress as well. Maybe, you know, we shouldn't put all of our weight on AOC, but she's amazing. Maybe she'll be president by then. But yeah, I think shifting the leader, shifting the systems, so that all people, so the conditions are there for all people to benefit from a thriving and healthy environment.
Thank you, Jackie. Manuel?
Yeah, so right now we're having a conversation about intersectional environmentalism, and hopefully sooner than 50 years, we'll be having conversations about decolonization and abolitionism and what that looks like. You know, it might take some good people in power, but I think where I would like to be in 50 years is dismantling the systems that we currently have, and rematriating the land so we can establish these deeper connections to each other and our environment.
Beautiful. Thank you for all painting a future that I'd love to be a part of if I get to make it at that point. But I'm excited regardless. And so we're going to transition to a few audience questions. And I'll punt these over as kind of open. So don't everybody feel you have to answer them. You know, pass it on as you feel you're comfortable and able to, but if you're excited about a particular question, jump on it. So those first 2-3 seconds of silence or awkwardness as you're deciding who's going to go are okay. And then if a question doesn't land, that's also okay. First question we have here says, within the Latinx community, there's a lot of exclusion of Black, Indigenous, and non-Spanish speaking Latinx. How do any of you think that the term intersectional environmentalism can also be used to create more inclusive spaces and break barriers within the Latinx community and environmentalism? Quien guste, dale.
I think I can start. I think one of the things that was very interesting navigating when I was in my graduate program, talking a lot about what white privilege looks like, that conversation felt really weird to me, just because they kept talking about the white person, and I kept thinking, well, I'm an immigrant. I am from Venezuela. That's not me. But then I would look at the mirror and be like, wait a minute, you know, a lot of people don't know that unless I say that. So I think one of the first conversations that needs to happen or continue happening, and a lot of the white passing Latinos and Latinx individuals is to ask those questions, right? And to really have a reality check with what is the privilege that we hold, you know, and it's a difficult one. I think a lot of our white friends are doing it, hopefully they're doing it right now, and to understand that we're not immune to it by any means. I was very privileged growing up. Even though I was an immigrant, I had a lot of opportunities that some of my other friends didn't. And I, you know, share this varying identity as well, that my father is not passing at all. And him and I will go through the same experience, and the world will look at us very differently. So even just asking that conversation and being brutally honest that a lot of the history of Latin America is rooted in very similar white supremacy and just kind of imperialistic practices that just went through the countries that a lot of our families are coming from, is something that we need to remind. It's something that we need to visit and start having the conversations as well. And of course it's challenging, because then you add this layer of coming to the United States. But I would say that the first step is to understand that we are not immune to a lot of what is happening at the global scale in the United States in regards to the white and Black narrative.
Thank you. Anybody else would add something else before we try the next question? Okay, and that's okay. We can loop back to it. This one looks like one that everybody can throw in one of your thoughts. A question from Sara Ramirez. Hey all, I'm watching from San Antonio, Texas. I've had the experience of feeling unheard and unseen in committees and professional development programs. Are there any national BIPOC groups focused on environmentalism that I can join? Or conferences, things of that nature that provide a network community of peers working towards the same goal. So if you're all connected to one that you like in particular, help Sarah out.
An event I really enjoyed attending was PGM 1. It was really incredible, and hopefully there will be some sort of like virtual thing, but it's incredible. Also, Intersectional Environmentalist, it's only a month old, but we're growing. We have an incredible council, and we have some really cool programming in the works, and we're really open to ideas of how we can build community and really build networks and things like that, and support groups.
I would just jump in and, from a local level as well, like I found Latino Outdoors. It was a quick Google. I was like, all right, who are Latinos that are going outside? I'm pretty sure that was my Google search. And I found it. I found Latino Outdoors. And so I encourage you, there's a wealth of national organizations too, that are there and present and established. But, some of the organizations and communities that can probably benefit the most from someone who has a passion and an interest and a commitment would be in the local level. So definitely take a look at what's around in your community.
Manuel, Jackie, or Ariana?
Yeah, if I may, yeah, I think kind of touch a little bit on both questions. It's like building relationships. Latino Outdoors, we currently are in the process of, looking at within our own organization and understanding like, anti-Black sentiments within the Latinx community, which is also prevalent, right? This needs to be addressed in order to like genuinely go out and connect and be intersectional with other groups. Here in the San Diego region, we've linked up with orgs like Black Girls Do Bike and Brown Girls Climb. And so Melodie, like you were saying, yeah, just looking at something locally, I'm sure there's a lot of different groups and organizations and chapters of various organizations that are promoting diversity in outdoor spaces. Yeah, so I definitely just encourage you to type in something as simple as Latinos Outdoors,
Okay. And I think the great thing is that you can do that now and get very different results than 5 and 10 years ago. I can tell you that because when I type in Latinos and outdoors 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I did not find this, and thus we created it. So that's a good example of what exists now because of individuals that are present here. Another quick question is from Janie Hazelhurst. Conservation biology and environmental science, especially in academic research, Ariana, are not always inclusive spaces. I am curious about something that could have been done differently or something that was done by your teachers or professors in natural science courses or at any level of education to make the science classroom and subject materials an intersectional growth space. What is the role of teachers in intersectional environmentalism?
I can attempt to answer this. What a great question, and I could like spend all day talking about this. For me, I went through a lot of different teachers, instructors, and professors, and the most useful thing that has clicked out of all these years of schooling that I was like, I cannot believe we have not done this. I actually volunteer like at a science camp, so I'm faculty at a science camp, and one of the things that we did before going out in the field was recognizing the native land that we were in, and not only that, but taking a whole section, disregard that you were there to look at water chemistry, to understand who are the people that are not in that landscape, what's their history, what is their connection to the land, and why are we there today? That was so impressive to me. In ways because it was a really great learning opportunity for me, but also because I could not believe that I had never done that in all of my years of environmental and natural resources courses. So that would be like the main thing that I was like, you know, as an environmentalist, as someone that loves the outdoors, that loves nature, loves ecology, that's great. But we also have to be very real and understanding that I am practicing the career and the thing of my dreams at the expense of a lot of people that were completely erased from their own land for the sake of us being here today. So that was huge. And then the other thing that I don't necessarily, I think, yes, every instructor should be challenged and pushed to give a more diverse history. I absolutely do not like when they start telling me the natural history of the world is from the lens of Aldo Leopold or, you know, Edward Abbey. No, that's not real. You know, a lot of my professors, those were the type of books that first were the introduction to the environment. So it's almost like if you're an instructor and you're looking at your syllabus, who's in that syllabus? Who are your students reading? And if it's a bunch of white men, you are not educating on the truth. So I would say that would be the second biggest thing that I have noticed in courses. It's just, it doesn't matter if they were the most published popular authors at the time. There's a lot more voices and we should include them for sure.
Thank you, Ariana. Any others?
I'd like to say too, I think also it's okay to surround yourself with professors that you feel like you naturally gravitate towards. I think, you know, sometimes surrounding yourselves with those communities that, I mean, I'll be very frank, like at Davidson College, which was an incredible liberal arts institution in the South, they didn't even have environmental science as a major. I had to design my major. I went through an interdisciplinary studies course and I took it through a Latino American lens. And sometimes it takes a lot of just like your own willpower to say like, I'm going to do it and I am going to try and beg and fight and claw at and find, you know, those people who are going to create a safe space for me too. So, and I think that naturally starts to flow a lot more resources and safety and comfort to really help pave the way for others too. So I also challenge you, you know, like, yes, find those leaders there too, but recognize that you have agency too, and you can be a leader for someone else.
Thank you, Melodie. Manuel?
So yeah, if I may,
Yeah.
I think, so I'm not an educator, but I do lead folks on outings, and Latino Outdoors has this great philosophy of the 4 Ps, you know, connect people to place, people to process, and people to policy. And I think if educators are able to, you know, connect folks, particularly to policy, you can really start unpacking, you know, what's behind like monarch butterfly restoration and who's doing it and why they're doing it here or there, you know, and really start to bring in how just one bug relates to like other aspects, because like I said earlier, nothing exists in a vacuum, and really trying to unpack how this is in relation to other things will also help kind of dismantle this Western ideals of knowledge where you have to isolate to interpret, you know.
Great, thank you. And I would say you are an educator, Manuel. You may not be a credentialed teacher, which, you know, that's its own thing, but you are an educator, everybody here. I am actually an educator as well, and teacher by training. So that's part of my component. And after this session, actually, I'm going to be doing a session with the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars, for example. So if in the chat, if that's new for you, look that up. That's an example of a type of program at the undergraduate level that kind of focuses on this question. And although it no longer exists at the graduate level, I actually benefited from being a Doris Duke Fellow at that time. So those are components that kind of help in that piece. Let's try one more questions, and then we'll close it out. Question from Jeanette Pantoja. In the Boston area, entrance fees and rules limiting open access to town residents using COVID as a rationale are undermining access to recreation at a time when we need it most. How do we combat these practices that feel like modern recreation redlining? How can we hold nonprofit owners of open space accountable of the impacts of their exclusionary practices? So whoever wants to try that question as you're taking it in.
I do not have an answer. I think this one, and I'll be honest, I think this one is so hard because COVID is so complex and there's a lot of safety issues that are at play. But like we spoke about earlier, BIPOC are being disproportionately impacted by it in terms of like who is able to get treatment for it. So this is a complex thing that I'm grappling with as I try to promote, you know, the outdoors for all, but I also want BIPOC and everyone to be safe as well. So I would really be interested if anyone has any other ideas on this, because with COVID specifically, it just brings all these different complications and so many access and equity issues here.
Yeah, maybe I should chime in a little bit because historically I've worked on getting entrance fees waived in national parks through the Every Kid Outdoors work. And so I am a firm believer that entry fees should disappear and that we pay for our public lands through our tax dollars and they should be open and accessible to all. But I agree, Leah, it's a really tricky time. I think about, you know, at the Sierra Club, we took an early stand to say, if you can follow the local ordinances and rules and do the 6 feet and it's safe, we encourage parks, local parks, to keep their parks open and people to be able to get outdoors. And at the same time, we had to call for the National Park Service to stop opening up because there was a lot of mixed messages coming out of the administration, including the waiving of fees early on, which encouraged people to visit national parks and travel. And I think a lot about the Grand Canyon and the Navajo Nation, who has specifically asked for the Grand Canyon to be closed and people not to come, and who are really heavily impacted by COVID. And so it is such a challenge because it's so, I think it's geographically based. If the local communities are concerned about safety and the local health communities are concerned about safety, there's, I don't know, it's really, really challenging. But I do think that we need to keep parks open to the best of our ability by being responsible. I know for my family, I'm really lucky to live in Washington, D.C., and we have a lot of pocket parks, and we go in the morning, and if more people come, we leave and create space for other people to be there. But the lack of leadership right now in helping to figure out how to protect us from this pandemic makes me feel like it's better to err on the side of safety than not. But that's just my 2 cents. It's really tricky.
Totally. And I know we're out of time, so I want to make sure we have time for the closing. I would say that one key takeaway that came from Leah and Jackie, is that question of what's the impact and on whom, right? To be able to pay attention to. So it made sense to advocate for closing national park if you knew the impact was going to be amplified as a disproportionate effect on communities that were already hard hit, right? And I wrote a perspective piece in High Country News actually asking that question. Equal park closures will have unequal effects, knowing that the pandemic is a magnifier of these components. So what happens as we might have like a straight across closure? To close, I have a 3-part invitation, and this is also because I want to honor the time. If we have a bit of time for other stuff, I think great, but I want to make sure you're not rushed in the closing. One is an expression of gratitude, however you want to interpret that. 2 is, how can people support you in what you do? If you want to drop it in the chat, drop in your Instagram handle, org name, whatever it might be, a call to action, drop it in there and say it as well. And then 3, what is at least one word to offer in closing? This could be a reflection as well, call to action. What's kind of a power statement that you'd like to leave this space with? Expression of gratitude, how can people support you? And what's your offering to the space? And whoever would like to start can go first, and then invite the next person, and we'll go around that way.
I can go first. That way I can give la última palabra to one of these strong females on the panel. So first of all, I wanted to thank Latino Outdoors, Jose, Luis, Ruby, and other local organizers for hosting this event. I also wanted to thank my sisters and brother for Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice. You can see us here and follow us there. We currently have this initiative to decolonize for climate. So tune in and take part. We're looking for folks to see how you're decolonizing for climate. I think my closing statements would be, let me see. So we need to be intersectional to understand the foundational structures that prime climate change and climate change degradation in the first place. Colonialism, racism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy. Because if we fail to see these interconnectedness of these structures to climate change and the environment, we will always be in a place where the environment constantly needs to be saved and it will never actually be saved. Thanks, everybody.
And Manuel, you have an invitation to go next, and then that's how we'll close.
That's right. I will hand it over to Jackie.
Great. Thanks, Manuel. I'll be quick because I took up a lot of time on that last question. So I'll just express gratitude to all of you. Jose, I've known you for a while, and I just really appreciate the grace that you bring to challenging conversations. I've learned so much from you, and to all the panelists, I appreciate learning and hearing more about what you're doing. People can support me by supporting all of you. Y'all don't need to support me. I appreciate it. And I'll just say one word in closing, just introspection and take care of yourself so you can take care of others. One sentence. I'll pass it to Melodie.
Thank you, Jackie. So yes, thank you everyone on here, everyone tuning in, friends and family tuning in, strangers tuning in. Thank you so much for just giving it a listen. Thank you to all you panelists. You guys are so smart, all of you, and it was so great to learn and kind of just chit chat. I was really nervous entering into this, but you all are awesome. So thank you so much. How to support me? Please support Latino Outdoors. It's very near and dear to my heart, both on a national level, but also follow the New York City chapter. We engage so much on there, and I just want to express gratitude to my NYC chapter, especially in the leadership team there. They have just held my back during this pandemic when we have all been pulled out from the outdoors. And then for closing, also Jackie, yes, a sentence. I'm going to do a sentence. But, part of being a part of a revolution is also revolutionizing yourself. So just be open-minded to that as well. And I will pass it to Leah. I almost forgot.
Thank you so much for having me, specifically Jose. It's always a pleasure. And thank you. This has been really incredible. Ways to support me, I think, would be you could follow me on Instagram at Green Girl Leah, and also our growing community, Intersectional Environmentalist. It's been really cool to see that blossom. It's been a little over a month, and somehow our little baby account has grown to almost 100,000 people, and and it's really, really cool. It's amazing. So you can follow that. And we're actually, sneak peek, we're going to be doing a merch drop today, and it's going to be really cool. And part of that money is going to go to one of our council members, which Pinar is one of the people behind Queer Nature, and another really incredible account. So check that out a little bit later. And the last thing I'd like to say is intersectionality is the future. So get with it, or,
All right, I'll go next. So again, thank you so much. Oftentimes as a panelist, like you were saying, Melodie, it can be nervous type of anxiety, but this has been such a great opportunity, and I'm so grateful for everyone's wisdom and time and energy for coming to this space and talking about these issues, because it's a pretty unique opportunity. In order to support me, I'm okay, but I'm going to put on the chat, in Burlington, Vermont, we have one of our first Dominican chefs opening a bodega. It will be the first Latinx bodega in the whole state. And they're fundraising for a lot of their structure. It takes a lot of work. So I'm going to put their link on the chat. So if you want to look at the work that they do, it's really exciting. It might seem odd if you're in more diverse areas to think that this would be the first bodega that the whole state would have. Of course, any help to that would be great. And I think I will just leave with the word of mindfulness.
Thank you. So thank you everybody that joined us. All panelists, thank you as well. Please feel free to log off after the closing word, which will be aquí se quebró una taza. Most of you are already in your casa. And today is still a very good day to arrest the people that killed Breonna Taylor and all other unjust deaths. So with that, hasta luego.